Welcome, gentle reader, to this important episode of Everything is Everything. We try to add value on the great questions of the age. And today, Amit is going to go after one of the biggest questions of the age.
Well, it's one of the biggest questions of the age, as you put it, but it came about where I wasn't really thinking of Everything is Everything or doing an episode or big questions at all. I was sort of scrolling through Twitter the day after the cricket match between India and Pakistan, and we're recording this episode 3 days after that match, though it'll release a couple of weeks from now. And I was deeply disturbed by what happened during this recent tournament that India won. We played Pakistan a number of times. Our players refused to shake hands with their players. There was a lot of aggressive, belligerent noise during press conferences from our captain and from others, and in fact from politicians on the outside about the match. It was almost like it was a kind of war minus a shooting, as it were, to use George Orwell's phrase. And it was incredibly ugly and disturbed me a lot, especially the noises on social media after the win. Like, it so happens that we won, but every game in a knockout tournament there's a little bit of a lottery element to it. You never know. We had a far superior team, so we won. And yet all the noise around that disturbed me, not just from the politicians, but also from the players. And that made no sense to me, because in the past, when I've seen cricket, Indian players and Pakistani players have always been friendly. Pakistani players are incredibly popular in India. You listen to Wasim Akram on commentary or Waqar Yunus on commentary, Ramiz Raja. They are like superbly popular among our people. Our players have gotten along well. And this in particular disturbed me because it makes absolutely no sense. I mean, when we think of how should we treat Pakistan, you can point to terrorist attacks and you can point to the old enmity between the two countries. But an important distinction to draw is a distinction that is really a distinction between two Pakistans and multiple Pakistans, really. But one simple way to think of it is that there isn't just one Pakistan. You have the people of Pakistan, the civil society, and you have what our friend Pranay Kotasane calls a military jihadi complex, or the Pakistani state, as it were. And the point is that the interests of those two are not aligned at all. They are exactly the opposite. In fact, the Pakistani state gets a lot of its legitimacy and power from constantly painting India as an enemy. And if they treat us as an enemy, they oppress their own people, right? So treating the people of Pakistan badly or showing belligerence or aggression towards them just makes absolutely no sense, and it kind of blows my mind. So that is one level at which I found this disturbing. Another level at which I found this disturbing is that fundamental absurdity of a feeling of nationalism in the common person. We can come to why the states use nationalism and is convenient for them. But for a common person to feel nationalistic, you are doing what Doug Stanhope once described as hating people you have never met and taking pride in accomplishments you had nothing to do with. And suddenly, as a country, we just rose up as a whole and seemed to do that all across social media, and it deeply disturbed me. And from there, I was chatting with it while we were driving to where we shoot with Vaishnav. And I spoke to him about this, and I sent him some links, and he said that he couldn't sleep properly at night. He was pretty disturbed by the whole thing. And I figured we should do an episode about it because it's an important subject. Now, in the past, we have spoken about the dangers of nationalism. We once did an episode on populism where we distinguished populist from popular. We did an episode on understanding labels, one of my favorite episodes. Gentle readers, please do check that out, where we looked at different labels like liberal, conservative, and so on, and what they really mean and what they have come to mean. And there we spoke about how nationalism is very different from patriotism and is very different from the national interest. The national interest is what is good for your country, what is good for the state. Patriotism is love for your country. Nationalism is an ideology that I largely tend to think of as kind of toxic. So my broad argument through this episode is going to be this: nationalism is bad for the nation. Any nationalism, any nation. And that's what I'm going to hope to convince you of.
Okay, Amit, let's get going on clarity on definitions. How do we define nationalism, and what does that idea fully mean?
The definition that I like of nationalism that seems to encompass all the other major definitions actually comes from possibly my favorite book on nationalism. It's called Imaginary Communities by Benedict Anderson, where he defines a nation as an imagined political community, right? Let's unpack that. a little later. But let's first talk about how we form communities, because we are talking about a modern concept. Nationalism is relatively modern, and yet it arises from primordial instincts. You and I have often spoken about how we evolved in prehistoric times in small tribes in the hunter gatherer age, and long before agriculture, long before society looked like what it looks like today. Our instincts evolved then, and we evolved in those times to be tribalistic. Life was nasty, brutish, and short, and we lived in small tribes, and it was natural to feel a solidarity for your tribe, to feel a suspicion towards the other, to be willing to fight for your tribe against the other tribe, to even die for it. And all of this is selected for, all of these tribal instincts within us. In our episode on fallacies, we also spoke about how a lot of the fallacies we suffer from also evolved in those times and aren't really fit for modern times and don't fit the reality of the world. For example, the zero sum way of thinking, imagining that the world can be engineered in a top down way. So do check out that episode on fallacies. So we had this tribal instinct, and initially, obviously, this tribal instinct makes you loyal towards your tribe, and then that gradually begins to change. Maybe you live in larger settlements, especially when agriculture comes about. Your loyalty expands a little bit there, and then different kinds of communities start forming, and there are different kinds of loyalties. I've spoken before in this episode about this beautiful concept that I love, which was articulated by the philosopher W.E.H. Lecky in his late 19th century book, A History of European Morals. And the concept is a concept of the expanding circle, where he says that the people that we consider worthy of our moral consideration is a circle that expands through time. And initially it starts with your family, your kin, and then your tribe, and then your village, and then so on and so on. It keeps expanding. And his optimistic arc of history narrative is that it will kind of keep expanding forever. Peter Singer wrote a book called The Expanding Circle, where he said that it will expand one day to include animals. Alas, it hasn't even expanded to include all human beings, but it keeps expanding in different ways. And one of the ways in which it does expand is to encompass what Anderson calls the imagined political community called a nation. Right? And this is something, and I'll come to the history of this shortly, but this is something that we first see happening in Europe through the Middle Ages and after that, and, given a fillip by the Enlightenment and the Romantic movement, which are actually at odds with each other, but both of them play a different role in forming this. And the key word I want you to focus on, Ajay, and a key word that all of us should think about is the word imagined. Right? So whenever I invoke any nation, it is necessarily an imagined community, because as Anderson points out, unlike in prehistoric times, unlike Dunbar's number of 150, we are imagining this community. We don't actually know everybody in this imagined community. We haven't met them. We don't even know their preferences by and large, but we imagine it to be something which we define narrowly in a necessarily homogeneous way, and therefore in a way that is fundamentally fictional at its heart. We did an episode on Hinduism where we spoke about how Hinduism was this beautiful amorphous beast. It was almost like an open source religion, for a long time, taking in influences from everywhere, and with people not even defining themselves as Hindu. You had Vaishnavites, Shaivites, you had different tribes who would not use the word Hindu. All this categorization came in relatively recently. So it's a beautiful amorphous thing. Do you really want to homogenize it? And when you think of yourself as a particular kind of nation, you homogenize it in different ways, not just in terms of what your religious beliefs might be, but also perhaps in terms of language. Like a lot of this Hindi nationalism that we see is utterly bizarre to me, because a lot of people up north really have no conception that people in South India have never spoken Hindi, and why should they speak Hindi, and they don't need to speak Hindi at all. And there are, of course, different regional nationalisms that can also happen, and that's not necessarily always a bad thing. So it's that constraining vision, and that's what I want to talk about for a moment before we start talking about the rest of it, that this is an imagined community. I often say, and it's almost a cliche on my show when I invoke the spirit of Walt Whitman and say that we contain multitudes. Individuals contain multitudes, and multitudes of individuals contain further multitudes. So when you imagine a community as one thing, it absolutely doesn't make sense, which is why it has to be imagined. Ernest Gellner once said, nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they do not exist. Eric Hobsbawm once spoke about the invention of tradition. that when you invoke a nation, when you say that we are one people, we are united by this, often what happens is that you find yourself struggling to invent a history, to invent a golden age, or to invoke a golden age and cast it only in one particular light so you can rouse people together. And this brings me to three essential paradoxes that nations contain within themselves, as Anderson writes in his book. This is from his book, second chapter. The first of those paradoxes is that there is a clash between objective modernity and subjective antiquity, right? And what Anderson means by this is that nations per se, especially when we talk of nation states, are a relatively modern concept. They're only a few centuries old. And yet, all nations, to justify themselves, to talk of themselves as a nation, will talk about a glorious past. And that is subjective. That is often a question of a lot of narrative building. Things weren't necessarily that way. The world was deeply complicated. Why are you smiling?
Under communism, the future was always certain. It's the past that keeps changing.
Beautifully said. Yeah, beautifully said. So, exactly. So, that is kind of one of the clashes. That is a relatively modern concept, but you're having to kind of make shit up. The scholar Shruti Kapila in an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me once said about Hindutva, which is a different kind of nationalism we'll talk about, one said of Hindutva, that it is a theory of violence in search of a history. Right, so that search for history or to paint history in a particular way kind of continues, and that is true of all nationalisms, even the other kind of secular nationalism that was dominant in India for a long time. That in a sense, you can't embrace the complexity of history. There is that effort that is made to invent a history that suits your idea of nationhood. But we'll come back to that later. The other paradox that Anderson talks about is universal versus particular, which is that nationalists would claim that everyone has a nationalism, right? They are born into it. Everyone has a nationalism. You can't avoid it. It is in a certain sense, it is constricting and essentializing. And at the same time, everyone's nationalism is different. So, you and I could be born in completely different places and we could have our own nationalisms, but it's formed by circumstance, and we could therefore be natural enemies in a sense, or on different parts of the fence. So this sense of universal, that nationhood is universal, but every particular nation is one specific thing, is another paradox. And another paradox that Anderson talks about, and that you and I will appreciate because the concept of nationalism is so nebulous, is that politically nationalism is a definite force. Right? We can look at the history of the world and see how it has been shaped by nationalism. And yet, when we try to define nationalism, it becomes very nebulous. There are no great thinkers of nationalism. We can talk about the great thinkers of liberalism like Locke and Smith and so on. We can talk about the thinkers of socialism like Marx and Engels and Lenin and so on. But there are no thinkers on nationalism per se. It is something a little bit amorphous that isn't quite there, and that is hard to pin down. And that also makes it sort of difficult to talk about, and in some ways difficult to oppose. Because as I'll discuss later in this episode, nationalism in many ways can also be painted in a really good light. All anti-colonial movements rose out of a particular kind of nationalism. Just as you and I today in modern times think of nationalism as deeply oppressive, it, in a different time you could have painted it in a different light and said that no, it's a force for liberation, bro. Look at this, look at that. And I'll refer to those histories and those aspects later. So that is another sort of paradox at the heart of it.
Is it that there are no thinkers of nationalism, or is it that in the modern world we don't want to take people like Hitler and Stalin and Mao seriously as important thinkers? So, if you take Mussolini and nationalism, I mean, there is theory there. It's just that we are loath to accept anything from Mussolini.
I would actually say that, and I'm going to quote Mussolini and Hitler later in this episode to talk about how nationalism can go wrong. But I'm really going to say that if you look at Mussolini's ideas and if you look at Hitler's ideas, I find them to be assertions. I find them to be a vision for the way the world is. and how they want it to be, but not coming at it from a bedrock of first principles, not coherent in that sense. It is like, this is my vision of the world, this is how I say it is. We have criticized Savarkar in some other episode where we've spoken about his definition of India as a place where everybody who belongs here, according to him, who belongs within the Hindu fold, is someone who looks at India as both his motherland and his holy land. This is where that person is from, and this is where they worship. And this is a convenient definition to other Christians and Muslims, and to say that Christians and Muslims don't belong here because obviously their holy lands are elsewhere. But the point is that where Savarkar doesn't go is the why of this. And to me, you don't qualify as a serious thinker unless you can tell me the why. When I talk about John Locke on liberalism, or Adam Smith on liberalism, or even when I talk about Marx, I may not agree with him, I may feel he is wrong. But even when I talk about Marx, they are trying to get at it from first principles and articulate a coherent, fully formed vision of the world. And these guys aren't. These guys are men of action, they are autocrats, they are acting in the political realm. And then what they purport to be their way of looking at the world is not a fully formed theory, but a rationalization for the terrible things that they are doing.
Okay, Amit, tell us a bigger backstory. How did this nebulous idea arise, and how did it become so powerful? How did it become this incredible world flattening thing that has reshaped the world so much, that has led to hundreds of millions of deaths?
All of it is circumstantial. Now, let's kind of go back a few centuries ago and look at Europe. And what is true of Europe then is also true of other parts of the world, also true of India. You'll recognize it. And circumstances are slightly different in different places, but the processes are pretty much the same. So, if you look at Europe, say in the 1300s, 1400s, there are no nations per se. You have kingdoms and you have empires, and you have people always with a loyalty to the local, because a local is all that you know immediately. So that could be your feudal lord, that could be your village chieftain. The loyalties are mostly local, and your local village chieftain may have a loyalty to a monarch somewhere, and etc., etc. And that kind of consolidation is happening. But your loyalties are local because you got to remember that not only are these the days before the internet, but these are the days before maps. These are the days before the printing press. You have a very vague conception of the world outside what is immediately local. So your loyalty is going to be immediately local. Your circle really hasn't expanded. So the ability to think of yourself as a nation in a larger sense simply isn't there. Who is going to spread those narratives? How are they going to spread those narratives? How are you even going to have the consciousness? Like, if you look back on olden times, the Greek people have existed for a really long time, but the nation of Greece is relatively recent. Earlier, 2000 years ago, you would have the Greek people living in different city states, fighting with each other. But that notion that we are Greek is not so embedded, because that notion of the other is also a little bit elusive. You have the barbarian coming from outside once in a while for invasions, and that's one thing that is happening. But often the notion of ourselves as a people is formed in opposition to another kind of people, and even that isn't taking place. Now, what happens in Europe is, if you want to date the consciousness of, for example, the English consciousness, when does it come about? And some historians date it to the 15th century, when you have the War of the Roses. Now, the War of the Roses, of course, was a 1989 film, recently made into a film called The Roses. But that is completely different. Popular culture lovers may not know that it is a tongue-in-cheek reference to something else that happened. So basically, the War of the Roses in the 15th century was a dynastic civil war. But one of the side effects of the dynastic civil war is that a lot of the feudal overlords lost their power. And the local allegiance that you had to a feudal overlord was no longer there, because a feudal overlord wasn't there. And one of the ways in which that war was fought is that both sides got commoners and royals to fight together. And as they began to fight together, there was also a common kind of consciousness that, okay, I'm a commoner, you're a royal, but we are part of the same people. What is that same people? And that, in a sense, is the birth of the English consciousness. According to some historians, in different parts of Europe, it happens in different ways. Now, a couple of processes to note. One is that language plays a big part in this. And when I will talk about India later, we will see why that is important. But in Europe, language plays a big part in this. That there is, through a period of centuries, a revival of certain vernaculars like French and German and so on. And then using those languages to unite a people and say, hey, all of us speak French. Therefore, we are one people. All of us speak German. Therefore, we are one people. Therefore, we have one culture. These are our great poets. The second thing that happens is the printing press. The printing press is huge because the printing press allows you to spread narratives of nationhood across Europe, across the world. So you're getting scale to your message, right? If you and I just sit here in Bami Karjat and we talk about Karjat nationalism, you know, uh, how do we can't just go out and talk to people in the village and spread the word. But if we can today put it on our blogs, we can put it on social media, and we can, build a movement much faster that way. And in fact, when I come to modern nationalism, one of my theories for the revival and exacerbation of modern nationalism is that social media enables that kind of primitive tribalism, which, you and I 20 years ago would have thought that we're moving away from. So the medium, in a sense, enables a message in this powerful way. And the printing press comes, and you have pamphlets, and then you have books, and it just burgeons, and suddenly narratives get around, and you are beyond the tyranny of the local, as it were. And simultaneously, what is happening is that feudalism is going down, and all of that is happening. If you look at what is happening in India, you have a similar situation where you have kingdoms and you have Hazar kingdoms happening, and even within religions, you have the Vaishnavites fighting the Shaivites more than they fight the Muslims or anyone else at a certain point in time. And then that begins to change. Manu Pillai's documented this beautifully in his book Guns, Gods, and Missionaries. That begins to change gradually over time. That first there is a sense of Islam, and how that becomes something that can be otherized, and then the British come, and the British are the ultimate other, and once that colonial power takes over, then there are different kinds of nationalisms which start emerging out of that, and we'll talk about them in due course. Let's go back to Europe for a moment. What is happening there also is that in the world of ideas, things are changing that give rise to nationalism. For example, people like Locke and Rousseau, especially Rousseau when he speaks of the social contract, they begin to talk about the will of the people, right? And when you begin to talk about the will of the people, about popular sovereignty, and that's when this concept begins to really take shape. What do they mean by that, and what do they mean by the people, and how do you define it? And this is something that kind of feeds into nationalism, because then if you want to talk about nationalism, you can say, oh, the German people, or the Serbian people, or the Hindu people, or whatever, But the moment you talk about the will of the people, you are effectively saying that, okay, the raison d'etre of how we are, brought together and assembled together is no longer that we are the subjects of a monarch who owns all our lands. But no, we are the people, we are sovereign, and this is the basis of our sovereignty. In an earlier age, it could have been religion, or it could have been whatever tribal affiliation you had. But now in this new world, you need something to, bind you together. And the concept of a nation comes. Now, the concept of a nation also comes from something that happened in the late 18th to early 19th centuries, the Romantic movement. And I'm not talking about, the Romantic poets and all that. The Romantic movement was an artistic and cultural movement in Europe during that time, which was actually at odds with the Enlightenment. Their beef against the Enlightenment was that the Enlightenment is too rational, too coldly rational, and that we need to rediscover our cultural heritage. We need to go to emotion, we need to go to art, we need to go to poetry, and that also became a powerful source of nationalism. That on the one hand, there is an intellectual foundation which is coming from the Enlightenment thinkers. What do you mean by the people? Who is sovereign? On what basis? And on the other hand, you have the emotional effect of going back to your old fairy tales and your old folk songs and making that something that you can rouse yourself around. So gradually in the 19th century, you have nation states beginning to form. And obviously, just before this, the two key things that happen are the American Revolution and the French Revolution, right? And in the French Revolution, there is the notion of la nation, or the people, right? And the people are rising up against the monarch. On what basis are they doing it? And there is a notion, therefore, of the fatherland, which is a term that they then use, la patrie, I think, something like that. Forgive my pronunciations. And, and all of this begins to come together. Even when Napoleon anoints himself emperor, it is not as a different kind of monarchy, but as a representative of the people, and, therefore, as a head of this nation. And similarly, the American Revolution, they define themselves in particular ways where the people are core to it, and there is a sense of that nationhood. Even if they are deeply federal and all the states have a lot of power, there is a sense of something common that is going on there. And then through the 19th century, you have nationalism spread, not just in terms of independent nations forming themselves like this, but even monarchs using nationalism to expand their power. Like one very interesting thread that you see through all of Russian history, through a lot of Russian history for the last 200 years, is nationalism. Right from Tsarist Russia, you have this sense of, this talk of Russia as one nation, because the Tsar is using that as a way to enhance his own legitimacy, that this is a great nation and I will look after it and I will make sure our glorious past is preserved. Even when the communists come to power, initially they make a lot of noise against nationalism, but then after Lenin's gone, if you look at Stalin's reign, there is what is called Russification happening there. In 1937, there is a celebration of great poets of the Soviet Union, but the one who is celebrated the most is the Russian poet Pushkin. And that strain is very powerful. That linguistic nationalism, Russian above all the other languages, is happening all through. And today, of course, we know what Putin is doing, using nationalism as an excuse for imperialism. And in a sense, all imperial movements are born out of nationalism, that we are a great nation and therefore we must expand and spread civilization because we know what is good for others, etc., etc. And then you kind of expand. And then in response to that, other nationalisms sort of emerge. So all the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, for example, including India's, in a sense, emerges as a response to the imperialistic nationalism of, whichever colonial power you are fighting about. So what really happens is that by the end of the 19th century, nationalism rules the world. You have nation states all across. In fact, Tagore, who I will come to later, speaks about how, World War I was caused solely by the toxic concept of the nation. He was an enemy of nationalism and the notion of nations, as it were. And so that is in a sense a potted history of the world through times. I'll speak about India specifically later and all the different domains, and I'll also speak about the good aspects and the bad aspects of it. You and I think, have both come to the agreement after seeing the entire arc of history play out till now that we think of mostly the bad aspects. But that's kind of a potted history of how over time it takes shape.
Bit of a side comment. I wonder what you think.
Mm.
Somewhere in this, Amit, I have also wondered whether there is a connection between this phenomenon and a different form of strife that was taking place in every society. In every society, there has been the people of the land, the landed people who feel deeply rooted to land and traditional culture and cultural conservatism and all that. The people who take land seriously, as opposed to a different kind of people that started emerging ever since the Industrial Revolution, who are the people made of capitalism, of commerce, of finance, of a cosmopolitan vision, of a globalization mindset, the people who would get on a boat from Gujarat and go operate all over East Africa and don't feel tied to land. So there are two alternative views of the world. There are people who are clever, who are able to think creatively, who are able to operate in the world of business, finance, capitalism, globalization, as opposed to the people who are tied down to the land and feel very strongly about land. How did this play out vis-a-vis the story of the emergence of nationalism?
I think there are two different conflicts here, and one is a conflict that you are talking about where land is central to you, as opposed to where individual flourishing requires you to just give up land and go elsewhere, and wealth comes from elsewhere. And people like you and me, basically, I think we think of ourselves as largely global citizens, and we don't think of anyone else as the other. But and the other conflict is the one between the globalized outlook and the very nationalistic outlook. And I think they are separate conflicts, because I can't, off the top of my head, think of a necessary connection between nationalism and an attachment to land. I think nationalism is more about people. Though you're right in the sense that one of the distinctions that Anderson makes in his book is that, not the distinction, but part of the, when he expands upon his definition of a nation as an imagined political community, is that he says that it is necessarily limited and sovereign. That for the concept to make sense, it has to be limited, because you're obviously limited geographically. Germany can only extend so far, China can only extend so far. We'll come to Hitler's concept of Lebensraum later, of expanding Germany. But by and large, the concept of the nation is limited, and equally, it has to be sovereign for it to make sense. Otherwise, what are you really talking about? You're talking about a diffuse community and all that if you're not actually sovereign. But I would say that these are two different conflicts which might play out in parallel ways. But if I'm trying to connect land to nationalism, do you think there's a connection? Or?
I think about it as obsession around territory. That's a land way of thinking. Whereas a more relaxed approach to lines on maps and borders is a part of the cosmopolitan outlook. I think of the Louisiana Purchase or the Alaska Purchase as, sophisticated, sensible things to do. Whereas in a highly nationalistic outlook, we would excoriate any potential transactions around land. So those are the fault lines where these two ideas can intersect.
Great point. Lots to process. We'll think about it.
Okay, Amit, tell us the good things that have come from nationalism. What is good about nationalism, and ideally as opposed to patriotism?
In this chapter, I want to talk about both the good and the bad aspects of it together, because there's a yin and a yang. They are almost two sides of the same coin. And, I have, in a sense, declared my position or my bias, whatever you call it, at the start of the episode. I think it's more bad than good. But let's talk about them. And the first aspect is liberation versus oppression, right? The first good thing you can say about nationalism is that, let us say that you are an oppressed people, and every individual is being oppressed, and there is nothing that brings them together to fight against the enemy, which, for example, most commonly would be the colonial power, right? And nationalism is a force for good, because it unites people, that, hey, we are all German speakers and we are being oppressed by, these English speakers, or we are all X and we are being oppressed by Y. Let's fight against them. And then you fight against them and you throw off the oppressor, and it's all awesome. And in a sense, most colonial movements have been driven by a kind of nationalism. This is something that Gandhi and Tagore had arguments about. There's a beautiful book which outlines, Tagore and Gandhi's debates on this. And Gandhi was a sort of a soft nationalist, and he would kind of argue for it. And Tagore was more where you and I are today, that no, it's just a bad thing, just avoid the damn thing. And I'll quote Tagore on this later. He's got an awesome book also called On Nationalism, a collection of his three lectures from 1917. But so that's one benign way of looking at it. And I kind of get the logic behind that, yeah, you want to rouse people together and you want to combine them, you want to get them to combine against a common enemy. It's useful. But I also think that that kind of rousing can be done on other grounds. It can be done on liberal grounds, that you can say that, hey, all of us are individuals, we are fighting this common oppressor, and let us put our differences aside. And what unites us doesn't have to be this notion of a nation, but it can just be the fact that we're fighting the same common oppressor. Equally, what I look at, what all anti-colonial movements are basically calls for the same damn thing that we spoke about in our decentralization episode, that, hey, we want to govern ourselves. Who the hell are you? And that governance should be as local as possible. We want to govern ourselves. You get the hell out of there. And if there is economic nationalism involved in the colonialist mind view, then you are also being exploited in different ways. And therefore, that is another good reason that you fight the colonial power. So you don't actually need to invent a shared identity to do it. You can figure out many good reasons to do it. That's how I would look at it. Now, if you look at the other side of this mirror, then you look at oppression, that every oppressor will use nationalism as a tool for himself, right? The German theorist Carl Schmitt once said politics needs an other. Nationalism automatically gives you an other, because anyone who is not part of your nation is the other. It is very easy to rile the people up against them. Mussolini did this in Italy, as we will speak about later. Hitler did this in Germany, where the Jews were conveniently othered. And we see many manifestations of this in India and Pakistan and so on and so forth. So nationalism is a fantastically convenient tool for the oppressor, because then the oppressor can say that, as Mussolini indeed did, he said that, look, this is the nation, and the state is in charge of the nation, and everything that I will do for the nation. So you shut up and listen to me, and if you say anything, you're anti-national, right? And I have the right to put you down. You no longer have any rights because you're against the nation, and the nation is everything. And this is a danger that, we've seen more and more of in modern times, sometimes in outright oppressive ways, where an autocrat just takes over a country using under the guise of nationalism, but most of the time in ways that don't involve an authoritarian government necessarily, but they impinge on different aspects of our lives in dangerous ways, such as in economics, which we'll also talk about. The next yin and yang is cohesion versus exclusion, right? An argument people will make for nationalism is that, hey, it's actually good. It brings people together. There's a certain cohesion happening here. If we say we are one people, we are together. There's a sense of community. Isn't that amazing? To which my answer would be that a sense of cohesion comes about in many other ways. Even economic incentives bring about a sense of cohesion. That is a beautiful thing about cities, that there is sort of a lot of these identities that we use in our identity politics get suppressed a little bit when you're in a city, because you're part of this large economic network, and your self-interest means that you want the maximum people to buy from and the maximum people to sell to. You discriminate a little less. Obviously, cities aren't a magic bullet, but that is one way in which people can cohere and come together, and people can form communities on the basis of other things, right? We might all like, for example, the Peter Cat Recording Company. Like, the Peter Cat Recording Company has this cult of, you have no idea what the Peter Cat, we will introduce you to some good music. So the Peter Cat Recording Company has a cult of people who love their music and who love their work, and that's a community of people. You have these great Hindustani classical music festivals where people will gather for these mahotsavs, where 2-3 nights you spend together and you're doing whatever. You have many different kinds of community coming up for many different kind of cultural reasons. And you don't actually need one homogenized identity to give you a sense of cohesion and to give you a sense of community. But now the flip side of that is something that is supremely dangerous, which is a sense of exclusion. Because the moment you say that we are a nation like this, we are a Hindu nation or we are a Muslim nation, you have immediately othered somebody else. And this is deeply dangerous and toxic. It causes all the fault lines in our society. This is something that we should watch out for, and something that we should beware of. The third fault line is cultural pride versus cultural suppression, right? Fans of nationalism will say that nationalism can bring about a certain pride in your culture and can, help revive it or help sustain it. So you look at, for example, Bengali nationalism. You look at what happened in Ireland. You look at the negritude movement in Africa, where you had a certain kind of black nationalism reclaiming their culture from the colonialists. And all of that is pretty awesome, and I love all of that. But at the same time, you don't need nationalism to bring about a cultural pride, right? You and I are proud of many things in our culture, or at least I won't use the word proud, because they're accomplishments we have nothing to do with. But you and I love many things about our culture and about other cultures. And that has absolutely nothing to do with, a sense of nationhood, right? I love Kishori Amonkar, but I also love Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, and I also love Van Morrison. And I don't need to build a narrative of nationhood or belonging or whatever to love all of these. I just love all of these because I love all all of these. But the flip side of the coin, the yang to the yin, is that you actually have a possible cultural suppression that can happen. Because if you define your nationalism in a particular way and you say that, okay, this is my culture, that is not my culture. Hindustani classical music belongs to me, but Sufi music is not my culture and is therefore bad. Then that hurts the diversity in your culture. And that is something that I am deeply against. I mean, of course, it commits a fallacy, which I will talk about later, that, even something like anything you define as Indian or you define as part of your nationhood, like Hindustani classical music is actually deeply multicultural in all its influences and all of that. But regardless, my central point is that if you say that A is part of my culture, then you're saying XYZ is not. And it is a diversity of culture that leads to a flourishing of it, and this is dangerous.
I also feel a little cringe around the word pride. We should be proud of our creative works and our achievements. And when I say our, I mean me. Okay, I have no achievement when Vishwanathan Anand plays good chess. I love him. So, that line that you love Van Morrison, you're not proud of Van Morrison. I mean, pride is something you've got to have done something.
Yeah, exactly. And but you can feel pride in some of the things I do and vice versa, because we play a small part in shaping each other.
Correct.
So I do feel a little bit of pride every time,
Yes.
something
Yes.
good happens to you, and vice versa, I'm
Yes.
sure. But apart from that, if I had no part in something, why should I feel
Correct.
proud?
Correct.
The next aspect I want to speak about is not yin and yang, because I'm done with the good. These are, the good things people say about it. The next one is really bad, and I feel strongly about it, and I want to rant about it. And it's not just something nationalism does. Many, many ideologies do this. And that is that when you are invoking a nation and when you are saying that I should be nationalistic, what you are essentially doing is that you are essentializing. You are tying me down to an identity of birth or location, and you are telling me this is who you are. This is the most important thing about you. Baki sab jaye bhar mein. And I object to this because I feel this dehumanizes me. So whether it is nationalism saying that, hey, you are Indian and only Indian, or you're Hindu and you're only Hindu and you're supposed to think in this way, whether it is some other ideology which takes some identity of birth I have no control over and did not choose and says, you are only this. Therefore, the narrative is that you are forever a victim or forever an oppressor, or you are forever part of our tribe and you have no say and you have to go with the central diktats of the tribe. I object to that. That is deeply dehumanizing. It is deeply illiberal, because then it attacks my agency and my identity as a person. So that is what, in a sense, I think all nationalisms end up doing. That they say that, like a Hindu nationalist will say that, oh, you are Hindu and therefore you are one of us. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I was born a Hindu, though I'm atheist now. We have a great episode on atheism. Gentle readers, check that out. And culturally, okay, I don't mind, nothing wrong with that word. But equally, I am many, many other things. I contain multitudes, as do all of you. And that is, in a sense, the biggest objection to it. That by saying that this conceptual category is fully important and that, that this is what you have to, identify with, I find that deeply disturbing, because then you're denying my personness. And the final and again, this is only a bug and not a feature in any way, unless you are a great oppressor, is that nationalism provides a fantastic tool for oppressors anywhere. Because then oppressors can shape the narrative, they can other whoever they want, and they can paint their enemies in a bad light. Like, for example, Mussolini used to call his enemies anti-national, right? That just because you oppose him, suddenly you're being painted as someone who opposes a whole nation, and therefore it is easy to send the mobs against you and to rile them against you, and immediately to paint everything in shades of black and white. And that's also deeply disturbing, and that's another facet of nationalism. And it's these facets that kind of explain why, in different ways, nationalism has actually led to so many disasters across the world.
I want to add one element to this story. It's something you and I have touched upon many, many times in this show, but it belongs here as well. This is a public choice theory vision of the state. Okay, that we the people accept the state because we wish to have some public goods produced and some market failure addressed. And the correct political theory of the vision of the relationship between the people and the state is that the state is the agent of the people. So the people are the principal, and the people hire the state and say, dude, we want you to keep the streets clean. And every now and then, the people will kick the state around and make changes when the agent is not delivering to the quality and the performance that is expected by the people. The heart of failure of the state in many, many places all over the world is when the state becomes all powerful, and when the state becomes the ruling class and the people stop being the principal. Okay, when we become subjects and not citizens, when the state becomes the ruler and not an agent. I've always felt that in that jiu-jitsu trick, nationalism has played an important role. You and I did an episode on state legitimacy, where we get to this puzzle about how does a state manage to get the people to go along with many oppressive schemes, which are often, frankly, really bad from the point of view of the people. It seems to me that a key piece of magic that has been done is to invoke nationalism. Because once you say nationalism, you've blurred the lines between the people of Italy and the Italian government. And now suddenly the Italian government lays claim to the idea that they represent Italy. And I always want to keep track. Excuse me, what is Italy? I don't know what is Italy. Is Italy a football team? That fine, it's 11 guys. They're playing football. Or is Italy the people of Italy? Fine, that's the people of Italy. Or is it the Italian state? Fine, it is the community that achieves and maintains a monopoly of physical violence on the territory that is Italy. These are all different separate things. All these get conflated through the ages of nationalism. And then suddenly you've got a state that is all powerful. And you manage to persuade the people that, oh, but we are the country, the nation. This is a trick that states have used to achieve oppression.
And I'm glad you mentioned, Italy as an example in this, because this is exactly what Benito Mussolini himself articulated, and that's the subject of our next chapter. So, something that you and I talk about all the time is how the state should be there to serve the people, but the state instead rules the people. That suddenly from becoming citizens, we become subjects. And as you said, this magic trick, this switch happens because of the nation. That the state will say that we are in service of the nation and so are you. And we represent the nation. Hey, in a sense, we are the nation, we are running the show, and because you are in service of the nation, you will have to listen to us. This is something explicitly laid out by Benito Mussolini. Let me read out some quotes from him. Here's a great quote where he says, "It is not the people who make the state, but the state that makes the people." And in another place, he says, "The fascist conception of the state is all embracing. Outside it, no human or spiritual values can exist. Fascism stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state." So, Mussolini fully understood this. He understood how you could use the notion of the nation as a tactical weapon, right? And you got to remember that he came in power in the early 20s. World War I just got over. And the way that he roused the people is that he said that Italy will be ruled by what he called the trenchocracy, the people who have fought in the war, the common people who have fought in the war, and used that as a uniting, rousing cry. And then constantly, because he's conveniently located in Italy, where the Roman Empire was also located, instantly he invoked that to build a nationhood. He said, look at the glorious Roman Empire. They were there, we are here. How much we have fallen. But we have to rouse ourselves and we have to come back to glory. And therefore he would speak about their sort of values, like their military valor and their discipline, and speak about all of that and rouse the people and, do things with pomp and grandeur so that, the people would be together with him. And indeed, they were. All the way through Mussolini's disastrous reign, he was supremely popular. He was actually the popular leader out there. He didn't even need to be authoritarian in that sense. The people were with him because this was such a popular narrative. And we know the disasters of Mussolini's rule and of Italian fascism, and where it took not just Italy but all of Europe. So I don't need to stress that. Gentle readers, please read some great history from that period and we will see why it was a disaster. And similarly, I want to talk about Hitler, because Hitler did the same damn thing. And whereas Mussolini's calls towards nationhood were based on shared cultural values, the glories of ancient Rome, with Hitler it was more about race. It was about racial purity. And from there, he built his nationalism and roused the people and brought them together. And of course, circumstances played a part for, Germany of those times, post World War I, suffering because of hyperinflation, being fertile ground for the narrative to spread and really catch the imagination. But it did. And every way in which nationalism can go wrong, we see that happening in Hitler, where you are othering a people to the point of genocide, where you see yourself as a nation that must rule the world through the concept of Lebensraum, which basically means Germany expanding and taking over other lands so that our people can spread out and live in peace. And again bringing us back to your notion of the centrality of land in some visions of nationalism. We saw what happened through all of this, to the extent that Germany turned a complete U-turn away from this after the Second World War. That today, I think Germany is just one of the finest nations in the world. Whenever nationalism is invoked there, it is a very benign kind of cultural feel-good nationalism, not something I would object to. In a sense, both Italy and Germany learned from their terrible mistakes, but in a lot of the rest of the world, we are intent on following suit. And you have a similar thing happening even in communist countries. Now, at one level, communism and nationalism might seem to be poles apart, right? Because communism, as we spoke about in our episode on labels, communism is all about class warfare, whereas nations are saying that it doesn't matter what class you're from, you're part of one people, all of us are part of the same people, it doesn't matter, and that's how you unite people. So at one level, they might seem to be at loggerheads, but at another level, they're doing the same damn thing. You are, building an identity group. You are saying everybody else is the other. Now fight, right? You're painting the other as the enemy. And even though Lenin and Stalin both spoke against nationalism per se and said the main thing is class warfare, workers of the world unite, not workers of Russia unite. But in a lot of what Stalin did, the Russification, the celebration of Russian culture, the prioritization of the Russian language over others, we see not just a continuation of the way in which the czars in the late 19th century would use Russification and would use Russian nationalism, but we also see a sign of what Putin would later do and what he is in fact doing today. Like Putin is a classic nationalist in that sense. He's invoking a great Russian empire and claiming that many other lands are part of that, and etc., and not recognizing the multiplicity of both nation states and of peoples and cultures and so on and so forth. So these are the terrible ways in which nationalism has gone wrong. And I would have said that there was one point, maybe in the late 1980s and early 1990s, where it seemed that we were entering a better world. Francis Fukuyama spoke of the end of history, though you will note with the question mark at the end of the original essay. And it seemed like the arc of history had finally bent to a better place. But there's been a revival of nationalism for various reasons, which we probably don't need to go into in this particular episode. I think, you have said, and I agree, that social media is part of the reason, that there are incentives towards extremism, there are incentives towards tribalistic expression, and even within politics, we've entered a very strange place where even a land like the United States has gone towards a kind of economic nationalism that just seems like completely bizarre, like we're in a bad video game simulation and there's a bug in the system and something weird just happened. And it's sometimes hard to wake up and think that what really this has happened,
Yeah.
but we'll kind of come to that. But this is all the bad shit that has happened.
Yeah. I want to just underline what you said in a somewhat abstract way about what folks like Putin or Hitler or Mussolini did to their own people. So, regardless of the pathway, ultimately, the nationalists mobilized their people into some kinds of violence, and that worked out very, very, very badly. Okay, something like 10, 20, 30% of the men of these countries were killed in war. It's like, what worse deal could you obtain? What worse destruction of the people could you achieve other than building this cauldron of war and pouring your own people into the war? So it is so graphic, it is so real that if only you could find a happy, mild civilization, if only Vladimir Putin could sign on for Rabindranath Tagore as his spiritual guide instead of Alexander Dugin, then millions of Russians would be alive today. It is so clear that these ideas, these philosophies are toxic and lead to the damage of the lives and the happiness of millions and millions of people.
And yet, it speaks tragically to the human condition that we are actually hardwired to think in these toxic and tribalistic ways, and therefore, it is a battle that all of us must forever fight. That it is not the ideas of Tagore but Putin. I never thought I'll have those two names in the same sentence. Not the ideas of Tagore but those of Putin which will thrive.
Okay, Amit, we've built an intellectual framework. We've looked back at the history of this scary idea. Now take us to India.
I want to look at some aspects of India, but when I think of nationalism in India, one of the terrible toxic ways that we've normalized and we take for granted is the impact on language. So I want to start by talking about that. That what happened is that language through spontaneous order in this beautiful bottom up way is khichdi of different influences. It evolves over time. So once upon a time we have a beautiful language which you can have many names for it. The name I tend to use is like Hindustani, which is really a combination of Urdu and Hindi, and there are within that language influences from Persian and various other languages which have kind of come together to create that khichdi, whether it is Sanskrit and Prakrit from other times, whether it is all those languages we will today call dialects, but then a language is a dialect with an army, but all these separate languages across India which became this thing called Hindustani, which people would speak in the north of India, and it contained what we would call Urdu, it contained what we would call Hindi, and it was all one beautiful thing, which is why people in these separate quote unquote languages today can understand each other perfectly well. So then what happened is that there was a political movement that started for a multitude of reasons. Part of it is 1857 led the British to try divide and rule, and they wanted to turn Muslims against Hindus and vice versa. But a lot of it also comes on movements from within Islam and within Hinduism that took them into different nationalisms and different directions, and I'll mention them also. But there was this movement where Urdu was more and more painted as a language for the Muslims, and therefore there arose something called Hindi, which was consciously promoted, and there were committees and organizations to promote it, which was sort of a de-Persianized form of the language. You took out all the words that had Middle Eastern origin and you took out Urdu and you said, oh, this is Hindi, and there was a certain element of construction to it. So the Hindi that we learnt in school, did you learn Hindi in school?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Hindi that we learnt in school, we were taught a kind of Shuddh Hindi. In fact, it is an interesting quirk of the education system, Ajay Shah, that in both the 10th and 12th standard, I got more marks in Hindi than in English, which is partly because I was lazy as fuck and didn't really study anything, but I had hacked Hindi. And my hack for Hindi was to learn a lot of Shuddh Hindi words and then string them together. So even the teacher would say that just give this motherfucker marks. Because nobody speaks in Shuddh Hindi. Right? All of us speak Hindi which we understand or local variations of it, but the Shuddh Hindi, where instead of darwaza you say dwar, and instead of dost you say mitron, it's not something that is spoken in everyday parlance. We speak in a much more simple way. Like one way of thinking about this is if people speaking English used only sophisticated Latinate words instead of everyday Anglo-Saxon words. That instead of saying we shall fight them in the streets, Winston Churchill had said we shall combat them in the boulevards, therefore combining Latin and French. But nobody speaks like that. And so there was this political movement where the languages were painted in different lights, and it was almost as if Urdu is for the Muslims, Hindi is for the Hindus, and they kind of go in different directions. And through a long period in time, a lot of our great Hindi writers actually also thought of themselves as Urdu writers and vice versa, because the languages aren't different. But you see this bizarre political movement that cuts this cleavage through our culture. And I'll speak of other illustrations of nationalism within our culture later, but this is one that particularly strikes me and makes me really sad, and it's illustrative of the growth of nationalism. You can look at it by seeing what happened to the languages. Now, while the British are ruling this country, you have different kinds of nationalism begin to emerge, right? And one of them is a Hindu nationalism, and we see a version of that today. We have spoken elsewhere about Savarkar's Hindutva and all that, and it is exclusionary, and it is, invoking images of a quote unquote glorious past and saying that, hey, this is what we all are. It is also homogenizing what is otherwise beautifully complicated. Like anything that is complicated, I am happy to attach the term beautifully to it because I love complicated, right? So there is something that is beautifully complicated, which is all our religious traditions and all that, and it is trying to simplify and homogenize and make one kind of version of that. And that's one kind of nationalism that is playing out, and it really sees Muslims as the other, and it is not so much anti-colonial in nature. So when people today say that, hey, the RSS didn't fight British, that's kind of true, and I don't even know why they deny that or fight against it, because they weren't really, that was not their main focus. It was about building a pan-Indian Hindu identity, as it were, and then figuring out what next. And equally, you have a Muslim nationalism that is coming up, and that is there in all the calls for a separate Muslim homeland, and that eventually becomes Pakistan. And even a lot of this is circumstantial. Like when I think of the accidents of history, I think of what happened around 1920, 21. Mohandas Gandhi came back from South Africa, I think circa 1914. And he came back here and he met his great hero, Gopal Krishna Gokhale. And Gokhale speaks to him and realizes he's a bit naive, and he says that, listen, don't engage in active politics till you travel around India. Promise me for a year you won't do politics, you'll just travel around India. And Gandhi says, okay. And then Gokhale dies a month after that. And Gandhi continues on his promise and travels around India without engaging in active politics. And after Gokhale dies, he chooses to do it for some reason barefoot as a tribute to Gokhale. I don't know what the logic of that is, but he does that. And then later he goes to a Congress gathering, I think 1917 or 1918, and no one gives him any bhav. He's this random weird guy who's come from South Africa and whatever, and we've heard of him, but he's not a serious player. I mean, and he does a satyagraha, which is very interesting, where, he comes across Nehru and Patel for the first time. He's gaining some clout, but his key moment in the Congress happens where he gets together with the Ali brothers who are doing the Khilafat movement. Now, Gandhi is calling for an independent India. The Ali brothers are calling for the revival of the caliphate, because the caliphate was abolished at the end of the First World War. And the Ali brothers are saying, we want a revival of the caliphate because we believe in the broader Muslim ummah. So now these two things have nothing in common. Gandhi is going towards a kind of nationalism, and a benign kind of nationalism, where he's saying, okay, Indian independence from the British. These guys are saying broader Muslim ummah, revive the caliphate. There's no coherent reason for them to come together, but they do. And it proves to be a tactical masterstroke, because Gandhi takes over the Congress because of this, circa 1920-21. And what has also happened in the Congress is the great moderate leaders of the past have died out. Like 1914, I think both Gokhale and Firoz Shah Mehta died. And the last great moderate leader is a man called Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah thinks that he is going to be the next head of the Congress. He's going to take over. He's going to drive the movement. And at this point, he's a very different man from what he became. And he thinks he is a heir to the movement, as it were. But suddenly Gandhi comes and he cannot figure Gandhi out, because to him this makes no coherent sense. If you think about it logically, that Khilafat movement and independent India, what is even the connection? What is going on? These are opportunists. They are coming together for a tactical reason. And look, all these fools are following them. To hell with this party. And then he turns completely, and embittered by this, he changes lines completely. He is no longer a moderate. He embraces the cause of the Muslim nation, becomes the biggest proponent for Pakistan, and in a sense, the rest is history. So anyway, this is a sidelight, but it's all about how these accidents of history can, lead to crazy consequences down the line. Because Jinnah was a very different man before and after this. But anyway, so you have the Hindutva kind of nationalism, you have a Muslim nationalism saying separate nation, you also have the idea for a secular nationalism that is coming up, mainly among the elites, people like, Nehru and Gandhi Patel also in different ways. And their whole thing is that no, no, we don't want any of this religious stuff. And we'll have a secular kind of nationalism. We'll have our own idea of India. And I would hold that that idea of India is as much fiction and as much true as the other ideas of India, right? When you're talking of nationhood, you are imagining it. There is no one thing there. Everything is complicated. And here I think about these different nationalisms, and I think that all nationalisms can only be imposed through coercion. Nothing forms naturally. And in a sense, the nationalism that seemed to win out at this time, the secular, tolerant idea of India, which by and large you and I subscribe to, was something that was imposed on the top. And it didn't emerge bottom up. And therefore, in a sense, it was bound to fail. So I look at India today and I think politics has caught up with society. Society was more under a different kind of spell. I had a great episode with Akshay Mukul on the Gita Press. If you Anyone who reads that book, it's a masterpiece, will show you how much those ideas were embedded in Indian society. And I think that, and you and I would be more in favor of one vision of India than another vision of India. But people like us failed because we could not do it from the bottom up. What Gandhi said throughout is that it is not enough to have a constitution and try to impose certain values. Even Ambedkar called the constitution a mere topsoil. He recognized that Indian society was different. And Gandhi's argument was you can only change Indian society from the bottom up. And somehow, I think a smug group of westernized elites failed to take that task seriously enough. And therefore, we have a rise of a different kind of nationalism that has come up because, that idea of India was existed only in a very superficial and shallow sense. So, but that is a different kind of rant. But these are the different kinds of nationalisms that were playing out in India. Today, of course, in India, we have a revival of the Hindutva nationalism, as it were. And right, and everything that we said about other kinds of nationalism in my mind apply to this as well, and it has led to what we saw a weekend ago when India played Pakistan. And you don't want to see that on a sporting field. You want to see the players hug each other at the end. You want all the discussion in press conferences to be about tactics. If you talk of the other side, you want to talk about them with admiration and humility, and both of them is genuine in any sports person, because every sports person recognizes what his opponent goes through and has come through and what they are capable of. You realize that any one result is an accident in time, but there is this virulent nationalism that I worry about.
What you want is the press conferences of Gukesh and Ding.
What you want is the press conferences of Gukesh and Ding, and even press conferences of the past, or even press conferences in other sports. Chess is more of an individual sport. You don't see this kind of chess thumping. And a great example of this is actually an India-Pakistan example. You look at Neeraj Chopra, when he won the gold medal 2 Olympics ago in the javelin, one of the people he praised was the Pakistani Arshad Nadeem, and who was his close friend. He would try to encourage him. He was almost like, even though I think they're more or less the same age, he was almost like a mentor to him, always encouraging him and all that. In the last Olympics, it was Arshad who won the gold medal with what I consider a sort of an outlier throw for him, 92 point something, and he won the gold medal and Neeraj didn't, and Neeraj was deeply disappointed. And there was this beautiful interview where Neeraj's mother was asked, like a TV crew went to her house and asked her that what did she feel about it, and she said, Arshad bhi to hamara beta hai. And this is exactly the sentiment that you want to see, that Indian and Pakistani people, if you invoke nationalism and nationhood, you can think of them as two separate people. Frankly, we are the same damn people here. It's the same damn culture. I have traveled through Pakistan. You don't feel like you're in a different place. Maybe you feel that, okay, some signs are in Urdu instead of Hindi, but that is the only difference. And I would love to be able to read Urdu as well. That is the only difference. And, that kind of thing is possible when it comes to the people, and we mustn't get carried away by the rhetoric of the state on either side, because the state will always invoke nationalism to strengthen its own powers and to turn us against each other.
Amit, tell us the ideas of great Bengali philosophers.
Great Bengali philosophers. See, you often say things against Bengali economists, and I understand the reasons for those. But among Bengali philosophers, Robida stands alone, right? Rabindranath Tagore was a truly great man. He was a truly great man for many different reasons. One of them, of course, is that he was a true Renaissance man, wide-ranging interests. He was a musician, a poet, an author, and just a great intellectual. And I want to read out some of his quotes on nationalism. And, we've linked his books right here. I'd want you to read them out as well. I'll read these out from my phone because one can't possibly remember all of them. Tagore referred to nationalism as a cruel epidemic of evil eating into humanity's moral vitality. And then he had correctly identified that at the heart of nationalism, as defined by the West, there is conflict, where he said, the truth is that the spirit of conflict and conquest is at the origin of Western nationalism. Its basis is not social cooperation. Elsewhere, he said, the nation, with its flags and pious hymns, cannot hide the fact that the nation is the greatest evil for the earth. And again, he said that what nationalism does is it fosters hatreds by persistent misrepresentation of other races. And it's worth sort of seeing his arguments in full, seeing them play out. He was, by the way, for Indian independence. So he's not going against nationalism because he's saying that, hey, no, the British are fine, they're good, etc., etc. He in fact returned his Nobel Prize famously as a protest. But he recognized very early on that nationalism was a problem no matter who it came from. It could come from Hindutva, it could come from, Muslim nationalists, it could come from Mohandas Gandhi. But no matter where it came from, that it was toxic. And a century ago, you have to applaud his prescience. Imagine if this technology existed then, Ajay Shah, he could have done a YouTube show called, and I think he would have called it Everything is Everything. Shopkichu, Shopkichu. So I look at what nationalism does not just in the political domain, because so far we've been talking politics, nation states fighting each other, lines on maps, all of that. But I think of how nationalism invades our everyday lives. Like, I am a sport lover. I know you don't watch sport. You keep saying life is not a spectator sport. You have many important things to. You don't even play football with us. But I love sport. I love sport because it brings out human character. There is so much drama there. So many beautiful things happen on a sporting field. Even though sport is fundamentally zero sum and the world is positive sum, in that sense, it's not exactly a perfect analog. But I love sport. But I also bemoan that within sport, there is so much ugliness that comes from nationalism. George Orwell wrote this great essay called The Sporting Spirit, where he described sport as war minus a shooting. So he looked at, for example, if I remember correctly, a football game between Glasgow and Moscow, and all the sentiments that kind of came out there and how ugly it got. Equally, in a different place, he spoke about how a football game in Spain a few years before that had led to riots because everybody was, riled up by nationalism and so on. We've seen the 1936 Berlin Olympics and how Hitler tried to use that to, push his nation's cause and, drive his rhetoric forward. There's actually a soccer war between Honduras and El Salvador. So in 1969, Honduras and El Salvador played a series of matches which were qualifiers for the Football World Cup. And there was so much sloganeering and fighting during these matches that I think there was a war that lasted 100 days with 6,000 people dying. So it is commonly referred to in the parlance as a soccer war. And it is not that soccer caused the war. Nationalism caused the war, but soccer was the trigger.
Amplified.
It was amplified by soccer. That is how much, passions can rise because of it. And I feel really depressed about that, like in a sense, though I wish Pakistan one day has great chess players as well, but in a sense, I'm happy they don't right now. Because I feel that if Gukesh was beating some Pakistani grandmaster somewhere, this same bullshit rhetoric would have again come up, and that's completely, not warranted. So I feel really bad because I just think that it is against the sporting spirit. And I mean, I to totally get why it's difficult to disentangle that. I mean, sport in its essence is kind of tribal. I mean, the reason Indians who have never been to England are saying, I'm a Manchester United fan, I'm a Liverpool fan, are basically tribalism. They're choosing a random tribe, and psychologists have determined that you tend to support the team that is doing well when you're 12, 13 years old, around that crucial period, which is why there are chutias my age supporting Manchester United. Well, good luck, brother. But, you know, um,
No,
good
but
luck.
right there,
Hmm.
you've got the way out, which is, we should form teams based on purely random imagined communities, put a little bit of old fashioned capitalism into it, have buying and selling of players, and you're done. You've decoupled it from the nation.
Actually, every team, in a sense, is a ship of Theseus issue, right? You say you're supported a team, but always sales are happening. You're buying players, you're selling players. So, hypothetically, every player at Manchester United could be playing for Liverpool 10 years, 5 years later, though it is actually practically impossible because none of them would get into that side. But hypothetically, it is possible. And the United fans would still be supporting United with all the Liverpool players and vice versa. So hypothetically, it doesn't make sense. I support the football teams I support because of playing philosophy. Because, me and Vaishnav talk about this all the time. By the way, Vaishnav Vyas, a cinematographer, has a great football substack. We'll link that from the show notes. Please check that out also. And we are united by our love of ways of playing. We are looking at the thinkers of the game. What is Guardiola doing now? How interesting that Guardiola has gone anti-Guardiola and, is suddenly defending more than he used to, etc., etc. These are the things that really excite and stimulate us. I don't really care if a particular side wins and another particular side loses. I just want to see great football, and if I identify with a particular footballing philosophy, then I will kind of support that. To move on from there, other aspects in which nationalism infringes is language, of course, as I have mentioned, and I think that's really sad. It is food. One of our most popular episodes of the show is the one we did where we said everything is Indian, nothing is Indian, right? Where you look at all our food, everything kind of comes from outside. To get nationalistic about it would be ridiculous. There was a time where, biryani is almost being used as if it is something anti-national. Ajmal Kasab was given biryani, unko biryani khilao, all these things. Biryani is not anti-national. Right? It is somewhat unhealthy, I agree, but it is deeply, deeply tasty, especially when made well. I am never going to give up biryani. You see the same thing happening in some ways to music. Like I did a great episode of the Seen and the Unseen with Shubha Mudgal recently. And Shubhaji was saying, and at one point I said that, listen, nationalism surely can't be in music, right? Because Hindustani classical owes its heritage to so many great Muslim performers. And she kind of sighed and she said, you would really be surprised that, even in music, there is a revisionist history kind of happening, a renaming of ragas being attempted by some people, etc., etc. It's all in my great episode with her. You can listen to that. That is crazy. And my whole point is that diversity is good. We should embrace everything, right? Or even in terms of clothes. Like what I am wearing could be called a Pathan suit, or you could say I'm wearing a kurta with a Patiala salwar. Is it Muslim or is it Hindu? The question is ridiculous. Clothes don't have religion. But the dress I am wearing would be termed as Muslim by many people, which is absolutely terrible. There is someone both of us know, and he was a close friend of mine once, who is a Kashmiri Pandit, who once told me that I don't let my sister wear salwar kameez because it is viewed by him as something Muslims wear. In fact, in the generation when we grew up in the 70s and 80s, in fact, a salwar kameez would be frowned upon even for women to wear it. It would be seen as something Muslim women wear. Now we've evolved and it's completely normalized. But this dress for men would be something that, you're wearing during Eid, or it's something if you're wearing, you're probably a Muslim. And that is also to me completely crazy. As Bob Dylan once said, you didn't think I was going to quote Dylan here, right? As Bob Dylan once said, even the president of the United States must someday stand naked. Ultimately, clothes have no religion and we are who we are. So that is another aspect where it is completely bizarre, the way nationalism plays a part.
Amit, by that yardstick, it would seem that the universal acceptance of blue jeans in all income classes and regions of India reflects an adoption of some California chic.
Well said, except that blue jeans did not originate in California, Ajay, GK.
Mm.
The neem originated in France, right? Because denim, the neem, in the region of Nîmes.
I don't.
That's what I thought.
But I
Though
thought
it
it
became
became
popular.
cool in American
It became
culture.
cool because Levi Strauss put those whatever on it, and miners used to wear it and all of that. But yeah, jeans we've totally adopted, bro.
Yeah.
And the final aspect in which that we want to talk about, there are many aspects, but the final aspect in which nationalism impinges is something I'm going to ask you to talk about in some detail, which is, of course, economics and economic nationalism, right? To me, firstly, lines on maps don't make sense when it comes to economics, because every transaction is a positive sum game. It's a double thank you moment. So whether I buy something from someone in Pune or from Poland, should make no difference. Both individuals are better off. Everyone else kindly get out of the way. But it is not like that. And even leaving aside that question of treating other countries differently and looking at countries as units and so on, there is also the question of how beautiful globalization is. We have many episodes on it. We had a two-parter on how much we love globalization, how dangerous and harmful tariffs are, how tariffs actually harm your own people. So this nationalistic rhetoric, like all nationalistic rhetoric, actually makes us worse off and no one else. So and the world is going deeper and deeper into the grip of economic nationalism in these times. What do you have to say about that?
Economic nationalism is the idea that we should use state power to protect or support certain firms that are considered Indian. Okay. Now this works really, really badly. So first, I just want to put up obligatory concerns. Is ICICI Bank an Indian company? Okay, and 90% of the shareholding is foreign. In any reasonable world, the entire top management team should be foreign, and so on. So, are there any Indian company? Do you really want to fuss about the word Indian? Infosys has mostly foreign shareholding, mostly foreign customers, and should we be getting stuck on the notion of which country is attached to which company? I think that is less and less meaningful the more you think about it. The second problem is the use of the coercive power of the state. What this boils down to basically is anti-competitive things. So in a good world, the firms should compete and productivity should matter. The firms should go wage competitive war in global markets without the government in the picture. And most of the time what's going on is the firms want to cry mummy and get a government to support them when they are not able to succeed on their own steam. And this leads to all kinds of rules and policies. So for example, the Indian government wants to say that certain kinds of data should be stored on Indian soil. And this I find just mystifying. It makes no sense at all. In the heat of India, you have to pay more for the air conditioning of a data center. In the intermittent electricity of India, you have to pay more to get 365 by 24 by 7 electricity. In the Indian labor market, it is more difficult to find the kind of top-end engineers who own and manage these large-scale data centers. Given Indian tariffs, the price of equipment coming into a data center is higher. It makes no sense. The right answer is that the data center should sit in Greenland, where the air is cold and the data center stays cold in a more convenient, hassle-free way, where you get plenty of renewable energy, and Indian users will rent the services of those computers. Why do we get stuck on where the data sits? Okay, the fancy way is nationalism. We're doing this because we are a sovereign nation and we want to keep our data on our territory. And somebody will say data is the new crude oil, which is like supposed to be a checkmate. But suddenly we have proved the case that we have to hang on to our own crude oil, no? Okay, what's really going on is just protectionism. That firms want to run data centers in India and they don't want a level playing field where an Indian data center competes with a data center run by Google in Greenland. And the whole claims around nationalism and crude oil and all that is used to shape certain business interests. And this is the same story over and over. So there is a small role for strategic defense interests, because every country needs to think about the safety of its defense industrial base. So for example, if equipment being used in the Indian military has a lot of components coming from China, yes, it's a problem. But that solution is to find the foreign policy so that India works closely with countries like Ukraine and buys a lot of components from Ukraine. And we create foreign policy conditions where you don't have to do it yourself. Because again, the worst outcome is the attempt at building all that military equipment in India. That is suboptimal, it drives up the cost, it reduces the quality, and just trying to push self-reliance is not very wise. So Amit, that was a great ride through history and principles and philosophy and unintended consequences. What are your closing thoughts?
My closing remarks is actually a plea to gentle readers, which is to say that nationalism diminishes us. Right? Note that I am now not talking about first principles and saying these are my principles and you must share them. I am saying, I'm talking about consequences. It diminishes us in three ways. One is that it diminishes us economically. Economic nationalism hurts only us. If you are going to say, I'm going to protect my local firms and place tariffs on foreign companies, it is we who end up paying higher prices or getting, less bang for the buck, as it were. It is we who suffer. It is we who are poorer off. It is our economy which is worse. That's number one in which we diminish ourselves. The second way in which we diminish ourselves is in a cultural way, that it diminishes our culture. You want all the rivers of the world coming into our ocean of culture. That is what enriches us. You don't want to restrict your thinking and say that, oh, this is our culture, we must celebrate this, and that is foreign culture and it's bad and this and that. You don't want to go there. So culturally and intellectually, which is an extension of that, we get diminished. When we say that, hey, we have Indic values, we don't need enlightenment values. To me, that makes absolutely no sense. You think about Indic values, you think about enlightenment values, you build a cocktail of beliefs which is all your own after thinking about everything. That is what you need to do. And the third way in which we diminish ourselves is in terms of character. Right? We diminish ourselves because when we think of the world in these rigid categories and they say that, oh, this person is from my nation, that person is not, we lose a chance to participate in the richness of the world, because the richness of the world is the richness of its people. And if we just embrace that and throw ourselves into that and learn from others and listen to their music and learn other languages, our lives are much richer. And by not allowing that to happen, by thinking in narrow constricted ways, we diminish ourselves. So nationalism is a great diminishment of the self.
Yeah. I think it was Tagore who said, I want the winds from the seven continents to blow through my nation. He wanted a Bengal that was open-minded and receptive to all the ideas of the world. I've often thought of a counterfactual, that when the great developments around Unix and the internet were going on, what if they had called it America Stack? Would it have interfered with the willingness of the whole world to accept those brilliant ideas? We diminish ourselves by bringing nationalism into the picture.
Well said.